Anyone who has studied the English language knows that it is very difficult to spell. There are plenty of rules, but there seem to be even more exceptions to those rules, and also seem to be an unending supply of totally unnecessary silent letters. There are also letters and letter combinations that are pronounced the same phonetically, but spelled differently. Why is water spelled W-A-T-E-R, but daughter spelled D-A-U-G-H-T-E-R? Dutch writer Gerald Nulst Triante made fun of the English language in a poem in his 1920 book, Drop Your Foreign Accent. Dearest creature in creation, studying English pronunciation, I will teach you in my verse, sounds like corpse, core, horse, and worse. And all that came after a little remembered concerted effort by some of the most famous and influential people in the United States to make the English language make sense by simplifying spelling of certain words. It was a movement so influential that it attracted the support of the President of the United States. The Simplified Spelling Board is history that deserves to be remembered. Though today we have strict rules on spelling and can take for granted the Herculean efforts of dictionaries for tracking down the etymologies of particular words, for much of history spelling was more of a suggestion than a rule. Modern English spelling formed primarily after 1350, as English again became the official language in England after 3 centuries of French dominating official functions, thanks to rule by French-speaking Norman rulers following William the Conqueror. Early writers of the period, like Geoffrey Chaucer, had internal consistency in spelling. However, it wasn't at all standardized. Chancery clerks respelled words by leaning on French conventional spelling, while others spelled according to their own dialects. In 1385, Chaucer wrote of the great diversity in English, reflecting the lack of accepted spellings. Further destabilizing was the appearance of the printing press in London in 1476. William Caxton, who brought the press, was English-born but had spent decades on the continent before bringing his printing business to London. His grasp on conventional Middle English spelling was uncertain, and his Belgian assistant simply had no idea. Still, over his life, he would publish over 100 books in English, which would do much to establish a national and accepted spelling. It's hardly too much to say that the range of devices subsequently used in English spelling was largely determined by Caxton's practice, writes language scholar B.M.H. Strang. Printers had a vested interest in being understood widely and developed house styles within their own printing shops. Typesetters were often paid by the line, which consequently led to a fondness for longer spellings. However, the greatest impact on English spelling consistency came from the most widely read book, the Bible. In 1525, William Tyndale first translated the New Testament, and in 1539, Henry VIII legalized printing Bibles in England. Many of these Bibles were printed outside of England by non-English speakers and followed Dutch rules. This led to the addition of the silent H in words like ghost for the Dutch geest, as well as in the H in aghast and ghastly. The 16th and 17th centuries saw movements for spelling reform, outlined in publications like Sir Thomas Smith's On the Rectified and Amended Written English Language in 1568, and the 1580 Book at Large for the Amendment of English Orthography. Most of these did not lead to significant alterations in everyday spelling. However, some smaller proposals did take, such as James Howell's 1662 recommendations to change logic, L-O-G-I-Q-U-E, to L-O-G-I-C, war, W-A-R-R-E, to W-A-R, and sin, S-I-N-N-E, to S-I-N. Other writers changed spellings to make the links to their Greco-Latin roots more clear. Thus, debt, D-E-T, became debt, D-E-B-T, after Latin deptium. And scissors, S-I-S-S-O-R-S, added a silent C after an incorrect etymology, linking it to the Latin scindere. Shakespeare makes fun of the differences between spelling and pronunciation with the character Holofernes in the play Love's Labour Lost, written in the 1590s, when the character insists that pronunciation should change to match spelling, and thus that everyone should pronounce the B in doubt and debt. Benjamin Franklin in the 1700s advocated for a purely phonetic spelling system, dropping the letters J, C, Q, W, and X and replacing them with 6 new letters. The end of the 19th century saw a resurgence in interest to reform spelling, especially to simplify it. This was partially thanks to the rise of phonetics as a science, first used in a modern sense in 1841. In 1806, Noah Webster published a compendious dictionary of the English language, in which he made some reform proposals, such as dropping the U from color and turning center, C-E-N-T-R-E, into center, C-E-N-T-E-R. This was followed by his 1828 American Dictionary. The Handbook of Simplified Spelling would write that the changes aroused a storm of protest that gradually died down in the United States as the shorter forms made their way into print, and now mark the difference between so-called American and British styles. A less successful attempt was Alexander John Ellis's A Plea for Phonetic Spelling, which drew interest but did not inspire much change. In 1876, the International Convention for the Amendment of English Orthography included both British and American scholars. The American Philological Association adopted a list of 11 spellings to reform, advocating for AR for the word R instead of ARE, and to drop the silent E from the end of have, live, give, and definite. Several other lists were produced by various groups advocating for simplifications. On March 11, 1906, the Simplified Spelling Board was founded in the United States. It was financed by Andrew Carnegie, millionaire steel magnate who came to the United States from Scotland at the age of 12. He believed that English might be made the world language of the future and even help lead to world peace, but that its contradictory and difficult spelling hampered its potential. Of course, he was also notorious for bad spelling himself. He committed $15,000 a year for 5 years to the organization, which he later raised to $25,000. It was the equivalent of millions of dollars today. The board had some 30 initial members, and they included some of the most respected minds in the country, such as Melville Dewey, inventor of the Dewey Decimal System, Dr. Isaac Funk, editor of the Standard Dictionary, Supreme Court Justice Davis Josiah Brewer, President Nicholas Butler of Columbia University, former Treasury Secretary Lyman Gage, publishing magnate Henry Holt, and Mark Twain. They were careful not to include the word reform to their name, likely to avoid the same fate as earlier reform efforts. They offered as an example of their plans to change the word believe, B-E-L-I-E-V-E. If believe was spelled B-E-L-E-V-E, wrote one member, I think it would be a good change. 2 days after its founding, the New York Times announced its support for the effort, noting that 90% of English words are fairly well spelled, but that a vast improvement could be effected by reducing to some sort of regularity the much less used tenth that makes most of the trouble. Opponents also appeared immediately, claiming that the problem was not the language but the teaching of it, and the changing spelling was offensive to the language's history. The board emphasized that the aim was a conservatively progressive evolution, aiming chiefly at the dropping of silent letters. Another member wrote that the goal was simplification by omission. This is the platform. That is the motto. The effort would be followed by teaching a phonetic alphabet that would be taught to children. Also among the promises was not to offer any changes to names or surnames, which would be sure to bring the public's ire. In justifying their crusade, the board cited spelling laxity in previous centuries and even pointed out that Shakespeare regularly changed the spelling of his own name. The board argued that spelling wastes a large part of the time and effort given to instruction of our children, keeping them from 1 to 2 years behind the school children of, say, Germany. They argued that simplification was inevitable and that their suggestions would unquestionably be preferred 100 years hence. Mark Twain argued that the new spelling would help immigrants assimilate, as it was spelling that keeps them back and damages their citizenship for years until they learn to spell the language, if they ever do learn. With characteristic wit, Twain added, "There's gherkin. What are you going to do with the H in gherkin? What the devil's the use of the H in gherkin? I'd like to know." On April 1st, 1906, the board debuted its first round of recommended changes, a list of 300 words they thought should be simplified. Over half are words that were already spelled the simplified way, including dropping the U in words like color, rumor, and savior, substituting ER for RE in words like center and theater, and dropping the middle E in words like judgment. Most American publications already preferred check ending in CK to check ending in QUE and preferred defense with an S instead of a C. The government had already made spelling like color without the U official in government documents in 1864. Why they were included in the list is unknown, but possibly it was to convince what few publications still preferred the unsimplified forms, or merely to convince the reading public that the board was not advocating for as great a change as some feared. Possibly the greatest change they advocated was to abandon the ending ED in many words in favor of a T and remove double letters. Thus, TOSSED, tossed, became T-O-S-T. T-O-P-P-E-D, topped, became T-O-P-T, and K-I-S-S-E-D, kissed, became K-I-S-T. They also changed A-N-E-A-S to A-N-E-S in anesthetic and anesthesia, and targeted silent E's in words like ads and acts. One of the more controversial changes was to get rid of O-U-G-H in words like through and although in favor of a single U or O, making the spelling T-H-R-U and A-L-T-H-O. One critic complained, there was no excuse for through with a U from any point of view. They also suggested replacing PH with the simpler F. But the problem that was left was for organizations and people to adopt the suggested changes. They paid for agents to travel the country and get commitments from schools and publishers to use the new spelling, and got 460 institutions commit to allow students to use the new spellings, while 5,000 individuals had agreed to adopt the new system. Setbacks abounded as well. The New York State Commissioner of Education thought the state shouldn't support the movement because he did not believe that the state's educational department should tell people how they must spell. By far their greatest coup, however, was earning the support of Theodore Roosevelt. In August, Roosevelt, without input from the board, sent a letter to the government printing office directing that all government publications should use the spellings in the board's list. Teddy called the suggestions very moderate and common sense, and that the government should be ahead of popular sentiment. But if the spelling board expected this to advance their cause, they were unfortunately incorrect. As documents from the executive branch began using the spellings, Congress was aghast. They had battled with Roosevelt for his entire presidency and saw the spelling directive to be an overstep. On December 13th, they passed a resolution, 142 to 25, stating that all House documents must be in the old style. A Supreme Court justice expressed displeasure that THRU appeared in an official brief. Newspapers across the country and across the world were quick to lampoon the crusade. How dare this Roosevelt fellow dictate to us how to spell a language which was ours while America was still a savage and undiscovered country, the London Evening Standard cried. In the U.S., the Pall Mall Gazette declared Roosevelt an anarchist, and the Baltimore Sun wondered if he would spell his name R-U-S-E-V-E-L-T. In solidarity with the new spelling, many took their new spellings to extremes to mock the idea, misspelling everything in parody. Even his wife suggested that he only supported it because the president himself didn't know how to spell anything. Roosevelt still insisted on using the new spelling even in official documents until Congress shot him down when he finally decided to rescind the order. He declared that it was evidently worse than useless to go into an undignified contest against the legislative branch. Mark Twain wrote that he was sorry as a dog, for I do love revolutions and violence. The New York Times thought the order has done him more harm than perhaps any other act of his since he became president. The spelling board would have to go on without his support and continue to push publications and schools to adopt the changes, but progress was slow and Carnegie began to sour on the board's methods. Amended spellings can only be submitted for general acceptance, Carnegie told the New York Times. It is the people who decide what is to be adopted or rejected. In 1915, the board sent a list of newspapers which had adopted the reforms but found only contempt from Carnegie. Not one Eastern paper, he complained. I see no change in New York, and I'm getting very tired indeed of sinking $25,000 a year for nothing here in the East. He wrote to the board president derisively that a more useless body of men never came into association, judging from the effects they produce. When he died in 1919, he left no money for the board in his will. The uproar caused Mark Twain to observe wryly that simplified spelling brought about sunspots, the San Francisco earthquake, and the recent business depression, which we would never have had if spelling had been left all alone. Criticism from England inspired the board to add James Murray, primary editor of the Oxford English Dictionary, along with an editor of the English Dialect Dictionary. The board could claim to have representatives from all the top English dictionaries on both sides of the Atlantic on their side. 1920 saw the board publish the Handbook of Simplified Spelling, but disbanded that year due to a lack of funds. Some of the advocates would continue to fight for simplified spelling in other groups, but the fight was never particularly successful. It's hard to tell how successful the Simplified Spelling Board was. If you look through the list today, you'll see that many of the words for which they advocated change are today spelled the simplified way, but many of those were already being spelled that way. Obviously, we never replaced all the words that end in ed with just a t, but a few of the words in the list, which were non-standard spellings in 1906, are standard today. Hiccup, for example, is spelled H-I-C-C-U-P instead of H-I-C-O-U-G-H, and anesthetic is spelled today without the extra A mid-word. In general, axe has dropped the E, and catalog did away with the complicated G-U-E ending. But those changes occurred at different times, and it's hard to tell how much the change was influenced by the board or even by Theodore Roosevelt. And of course, the English language today is still beset by silent letters and rules that are full of exceptions. And in the electronic age, it's hard to tell if spelling even matters at all. I mean, people that are writing online seem to operate all by their own sets of spelling rules. Spell check programs seem as likely to replace your word with a word that makes no sense at all as they are to correct your spelling, and some grammarians worry that Twitter is destroying the English language. A 2012 article in Wired magazine argues that spelling changes that are common now in electronic communication like emails and text messaging means that we need to loosen our entire idea of correct spelling. But a 2021 article in the Educational Psychology Review argues that spelling skills are still highly prized by recruiters in many fields, and notes research that says that people will stop reading a web page at the point that they find the first spelling error. Or maybe we will simply move to a new board of simplified spelling who will move us to Twitter speak so that we spell the word you, Y-O-U, instead simply you. After all, L-O-L is now in the Oxford English Dictionary. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on Forgotten History, all you have to do is subscribe.